Good morning, everyone. Once again, welcome to this webinar on inequality. Today we have also the opportunity to celebrate the International Day for Distributional Poverty, as you know. It's October. A day to celebrate with concrete actions. So this is why we lined up a number of events, and this specific event is part of that celebration. We decided to discuss inequality with our very distinguished friend and colleague, Pedro, the director of the Human Development Report Office, as you know. And the idea behind it is also to make the link with poverty. Because one good question we have is, why is UNDP focusing on inequality? Shall we not do more on poverty? And that's the kind of question that we've heard from member states. While it's a fair question, I think it's very clear that overlapping and rising inequalities and deprivations are actually perpetuating intergenerational poverty. So the link is complex, but it's there. And what we see right now is that we have, when you look at overall poverty, we have about 700 million. And when you look at the multidimensional poverty, it increases to 1.3 billion. So it means that just looking at the income part of poverty and inequality may be misleading. So we need to look at inequality from a broader perspective. And it's very true that inequality, poverty, exclusion are the heart of the Agenda 2030. So this is why we really needed to have this conversation. Also to have new perspectives on what we as UNDP can do to better position ourselves in this whole landscape. We have also designed an interesting MOOC. It's called Designing a Multidimensional Poverty Index. Renata will maybe speak to it later on, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Pedro for making himself available to share with us his recent work, give us a flavor, and really inspire us. I think we've been all inspired by the Nobel Prize in economics, focusing on poverty. I think that really opens up spaces for us. And it's really important to have this kind of conversation to see how we can better position ourselves, what's our niche, and how we can contribute that value to this whole conversation. So, Pedro, thanks, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Masur and Renata, for inviting me to share some thoughts on the journey that we are undertaking in the Human Development Report to think about inequality. So I will not present a lot of detail, but will give you a little bit of a flavor of the broad themes that we are trying to include in the Human Development Report this year. And I just want to signal that the report this year is not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a journey, through which we need collectively as UNDP, working with others, to understand much better what you just said, Masud, the relationships between inequalities, poverty, and the multiple deprivations that we are all working to eradicate in the context of the Agenda for Sustainable Development. So I'll speak mostly about the work that we have been doing, and I will also welcome an opportunity to have a discussion and get feedback from all of you, because the report is not finished yet, so there is still some time and opportunity to recalibrate a little bit. And so I will try not to spend too much time speaking to leave enough time for a conversation with everyone. So one may even wonder, why should we worry about inequality at all? Because after all, we've seen certainly over the course of this century marked improvements in standards of living that have been fairly widespread around the world. We know that when it comes to rates of economic growth in developing countries, there's been a convergence towards the more advanced countries. But here on this slide, you see the evolution of Human Development Index, which is a broader measure that includes not only income but also health and education. And you see that not only are lines going up across all regions, but the rate of improvement is increasing for those at the bottom. So you see Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, that over the course of this century has been making very rapid improvements in human development. Moreover, many economists have done more formal analysis of the relative contributions of distribution versus growth. And you see some results on the right. The evidence suggests that growth appears to matter much more to increase welfare than distribution. And Robert Lucas has even a famous quote saying that we should basically forget about anything to do with redistribution, because the impact of growth in improving standards of living is much, much more important. So this contrasts, this more analytical approach, and some of the evidence contrasts with what people seem to be caring about around the world. So this slide shows the evolution of people expressing preference for more equality. So the dots, the blue dots, represent the increase in the percentage of people in different countries, each dot is a country, asking for more equality, comparing the first decade of the 21st century with the second decade of the 21st century. You see on the right-hand side the question. Of course, at any point in time, you would expect many people to say that income should be more equally distributed. But the relevance of this chart is the evolution, is the change. That over time, you seem to have more people demanding more equality in the distribution of income. And this is fairly widespread not only across countries, but also across political affiliation. So the aspiration for more equality appears to be driven not only by whether you live left, or you live right, or you're in the center. Across the political spectrum, there seems to be this aspiration for more equality. Okay. So basically, if you contrast, this tension is at the heart of the motivation for the report this year. And we essentially are posing three questions. The first is whether people are bothered by something else other than income and wealth inequality. The second question is whether this worry that people appear to have is not being captured by the measures of income and wealth inequality that we use day to day. The Gini coefficient dominates many of the discussions on income inequality. And the third question is many people are worried not only not because of the past, the past trends, but more about so
This one.
So these are the three questions, so let me repeat them. So first, maybe people are bothered by something other than income inequality. The second question is whether the measures that we're using, the indicators that we're relying on to capture inequality, may not be appropriate to reflect what is bothering people. And then finally, the third question is whether people are worried more about what's coming and less about what happened in the past, and even the way in which they live today. So these three questions, therefore, gave us the inspiration for the framework that we're using in the report. And it's a framework that attempts to go beyond the current discussions on income inequality, so trying to open this new window that you spoke about, Masur, by going beyond income, by going beyond averages, and by going beyond today. freedom. So these are the motivation questions, and then the next slide will show the framework. Perfect. I can do it like that. The slides up to now don't matter that much because it's mostly text, but from now on I want to show you some data and some framework, and the slides are here. So what I will do now in the rest of the presentation is to go over these three aspects: what the report is trying to do by going beyond income, by going beyond averages, and by going beyond. So let me start with going beyond income. What does that mean? What is the framing or the conceptual framework that we use with this idea of going beyond income? You wouldn't be surprised that we are going to rely on the capabilities approach, which is the foundational approach, theory, if you want, that is at the basis of the human development approach. Sometimes the human development approach is associated exclusively with human development index, with the HDI, which is a combination of income, health, and education. But it's important to understand what the capabilities approach is, and it's an alternative or a complement to the more traditional way in which social welfare is evaluated by many policymakers and most economists. So you see on the left the way in which typically in economics one assesses or comes to the construction of what is called a social welfare function. There is individual utility that is derived by income, and the assumption is that utility increases as the level of income goes up. And so individual utility of all of us is then put together, aggregated in what is called a social welfare function. And so the objective of a policymaker from this perspective is to maximize this social welfare function. And so to maximize this social welfare function, of course, you have to increase income. So growth is important, but since you are aggregating the utilities of many people, you also have to care about the way in which additional income is distributed around people. So that's why you get to a combination of the relative importance of growth versus distribution from this perspective. The capabilities approach is very, very different. It doesn't suggest that we can reduce social welfare or an objective to policymakers to a single number. We cannot aggregate everything to a single number. Instead, we have to think about a set of capabilities, which you see on the right-hand side. So capabilities are everything that enables people to do and be what they aspire to do and be. It's this idea of freedom of choice. So it's not a number, but it's, as I said, a set of multiple capabilities. But the question, therefore, is which capabilities to choose and how to measure them. So when the Human Development Report started in 1990, the idea was to intersect the capability set with the discourse at the time that was focused on this idea of basic needs. What are the basic needs of people? And from the intersection of these two concepts resulted Human Development Index. The idea being that people need to have the minimum level of resources, the minimum level of education, and the minimum level of health to be able to exercise their freedoms. But Amartya Sen was very, very explicit in saying that we should look at capabilities and the set of capabilities as they evolve over time, as they become relevant over time, as people's aspirations evolve, as values in society change. And so, based on this approach, therefore, and taking this lens to the discussion of inequality, one of our main findings in the report is that we find two different trends when it comes to inequality in capabilities, or inequalities in human development. on the one hand, on the left, what we're seeing is that there are gaps narrowing in what we call basic achievements, basic capabilities. So the story that is often told that we are making progress in eradicating poverty, in reducing under 5 child mortality rates, making improvements in primary enrollment rates, all of these are captured by this idea of convergence in basic capabilities. But what we're also seeing, and you see that on the right-hand side, is that there are gaps opening up in new aspects of life. So when you try to look into capabilities that go beyond the basic, and there are a number of capabilities that we look at in the report, then you see new gaps opening up. And so one of the contentions we're making is that these gaps that are opening up are linked to this idea that people are being bothered even though they are making progress on the basics. They see that some are pulling ahead in other aspects of life that may be more relevant over the course of the 21st century. So this may be one way of explaining the difference between what the data seems to show and the apprehension of people when it comes to inequalities. There is a way of summarizing these two dynamics by considering two expressions by Angus Deaton. He wrote a book a few years ago that he called The Great Escape from Poverty and Extreme Deprivation. So this is an important story that has unfolded over the last part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. But there is a new story emerging about people that, again, by using Angus Deaton expression, are losing the narratives of their lives. So these are people that are not seeing themselves fitting in a 21st century that is changing in a very rapid way. So this is a summary of what we are doing in the report by looking beyond income. So let me move now to beyond averages and show you a few things. So one of the important contributions that we hope to make with the report is to show the importance of trying to understand what happens across the whole distribution of income, and not try to summarize what happens when it comes to inequality in income or wealth by trying to reduce everything to a number, like the Gini coefficient. Many discussions paint the evolution and dynamics of inequality by invoking a single number, like the Gini coefficient. And to see why that may be problematic, just consider the graph that you see here, which has is a growth incidence curve. This means that it plots the gains or losses in income of people across the income distribution, so from the poorest all the way to the richest people. And what the graph shows is that you see a little bit of growth here at the bottom and a lot of growth at the very top. So this kind of dynamics, this is for the case of Brazil, cannot be captured if you only look at the evolution of the Gini coefficient. In fact, you may have a Gini coefficient that in the case of Brazil has actually been going down. And so people say inequality in Brazil has been going down. But has it? Well, it depends on where you sit on the income distribution, right? And even if it had been going down, measured by the Gini coefficient, which is not contested, the perception, the way people feel about how income is being distributed as an economy grows is very different depending on where you see it. The same thing happens for Europe. So this is new analysis that we're going to present in the report about the gains across the income distribution in Europe since 1980. And once again, you see that people at the top have captured most of the gains in income distribution. So in fact, the top 1% captured 13% of growth, which is as much as the bottom 40% captured on average across Europe since 1980. South Africa shows a similar pattern, with similar to Brazil, a little bit different compared to the one in Europe. Similar to Brazil in that you see also gains here at the bottom, and of course at the very top. But the pattern starts to emerge where there are many people in the middle here that are sort of losing out. Many of these people are losing the narrative of their lives. This is why inequality matters. Because inequality is not only, or welfare of a society, well-being of a society, is not only about looking at those at the bottom. That's important, and we're doing a good job. Not perfect, and I'll speak to that, but we are doing a good job of progress on that front. But the reason why inequality seems to be mattering, to matter more and more, is largely because there's a large segments of population in many countries that are losing out, that are being left behind for a range of reasons. Now, I said convergence in basics, but not everything, but we are not fully there yet. And you see here in the case of South Africa, those at the very bottom actually have lost. And it's not dissimilar from what happened in Brazil. Those at the very bottom are actually losing. So while we have this pattern of convergence on the basics, we also have many people that are left behind. And this is another dimension of why inequality matters, because if you take an index like the headcount poverty rate or the Multidimensional Poverty Index, you have 1.3 billion people that are poor, or 650 million that are income poor. But what's happening to them when you look at those that are at the bottom? So what this graph shows is that those that haven't made it over the line, in this case of income poverty, have actually not seen any improvements in their income. So not only are they being left behind, but they are stuck. They are stuck at the bottom. So this is another important dimension of what one can do by going beyond averages and trying to understand what's happening to those living. And then the final aspect that I want to mention, and we devote quite substantial attention to it, is gender inequality. Gender inequality is an illustration of what are called group-based inequalities, or horizontal inequalities. Sometimes we also call it horizontal inequalities. So these are horizontals, so these are inequalities across groups of people. There is no reason why there should be any group-based inequality, if you think about it. Groups defined by gender, or defined by where they live, or by their ethnicity, there shouldn't be in principle any inequality. So the objective here is very clear. While for income you can argue, so what should be the objective, how much inequality should the society tolerate? When it comes to gender inequality, it's unambiguous. There should be none. It should be zero. So what we document in the report actually is that the same pattern of convergence in basic and divergence in enhanced is happening when it comes to gender. So there's no question that you can construct a narrative on gender inequality that looks very positive. But if you look carefully at the indicators that are used to construct the narrative, they are all linked to more basic achievements. Once we start moving towards more empowering achievements, then the situation turns. The situation turns and you actually see gaps becoming larger. So again, when it comes to gender equality, there's this duality between things getting better on basic dimensions and things actually getting worse on dimensions that are more empowering for women. So as women become closer to positions of power, there we see gaps remaining large and sometimes increasing. And what you see on this slide is new analysis that we produce in the report that tries to capture social norms and social norms towards gender equality. And what we find is there's actually a backlash on average against gender equality. It varies from country to country, but if you take the average, you see social norms, including in many advanced countries, many developed countries, turning against gender equality. And our interpretation, once again, is that as progress moves towards more empowering areas, then there is a little bit of backlash. social norms react against these problems. So this is an illustration of the kind of analysis that we do in this section of the report by going to part of the report by going beyond averages. So let me move quickly to beyond today. So beyond today is the part where we try to answer the question, so what should we do? What can be done? But before we move into policies, we look into two trends that are likely to determine distribution of inequalities in the 21st century. One is climate change, and the other one is technology. So on climate change, the argument has already been made in the Human Development Report in 2007-2008 that the impacts of climate change are unequally distributed and are likely to exacerbate many of the inequalities that already exist. So we now have more evidence. So this chart here shows the evolution of cross-country inequality from 1960 to 2010. So the thick black line shows the reduction in inequality, and the shaded line shows how much more this reduction could have been in the absence of climate change. So you could see that there could have been much more convergence than the one that actually occurred. So what the report shows is new evidence that confirms and provides more detailed analysis of the differential impacts of climate change on inequality. But also it makes the case in the other direction, that as inequalities become exacerbated, especially on these more enhanced capabilities, it may become harder and harder to address climate change. So one of the policies, for to give an example, one of the policies that is often advocated for mitigating climate change is some measures related to carbon pricing, so that it reflects more accurately the social costs of the use of carbon. Now, when this is implemented through taxes, this can become politically very difficult. And one of the reasons is the way in which the taxes that are generated are used. As inequalities grow, this difficulty can be exacerbated, because you can conceive of a way in which the revenue that is mobilized through a carbon tax, implemented through whichever way, is redistributed to the population, especially to those that are at the bottom. But as these inequalities grow, the implementation of this policy becomes more and more difficult, both on the side of getting support for a tax, as well as the ability of governments to redistribute it to the population. So there is a feedback loop through which inequality can actually make addressing climate change more difficult, or to put it differently, in a more positive way perhaps, by addressing inequalities, you're also making it more likely or easier to address the climate change challenge. And on technology, you know the story, it's in the news, it's everywhere, that we are perhaps undergoing a new revolution, industrial revolution kind of transformation, that is basically driven by, you see some evidence here, in economic terms, it's driven by the relative decline in the price of investment goods. So what this means is that firms have an incentive to invest in capital, in machines, in buildings, and to replace people, tasks performed by people. And this is also reflected, for instance, in the market power that some firms are acquiring. So if you think of many of the big tech companies, they are very powerful, not only in economic terms, but also increasingly also in political terms. So the argument we make here on the technology chapter is similar to the one on climate, is that this trajectory of technology is not inevitable. It's not something that comes from somewhere out there. It's something that we shape ourselves. Our economies and our societies are shaping the direction of technological change and the way in which these technologies are being used in a way that is leading to the replacement of people in many tasks. But it does not have to be that way. they can also be harnessed, technology can also be harnessed to actually reinstate the demand for labor. It can also be equalized. So with these two trends, after analyzing these two trends, we then come finally to the policy recommendation, and I will end with that. So the discussions on policy, or the debate on policy to redress inequality, are dominated by discussions of redistribution, essentially, by using the fiscal system through taxes and transfers to reduce inequality. Yeah, and this is driven in part by trends that we document in the reports that are global, relate to the decline in corporate income tax rates, the decline in personal income tax rates compared to what was prevalent a few decades ago. And so this is suggesting that one way of fixing the problem is to use the fiscal system, and you can see how powerful it can be. So this chart shows the Gini coefficient for advanced economies and developing economies before taxes and transfers. So those are the two bars on the left. And you see that the Gini coefficient is about 0.5 in both developed and developing countries. So this is what the market basically determines. Earnings determined by the market. After taxes and transfers, you see that both in developed and developing countries, the Gini coefficient drops quite significantly. It drops much more, though, in advanced economies than it does in developing economies. So this would suggest that there's a lot of space for developing economies to use redistribution to redress income, at least income inequality. Which is certainly true, but there are some warnings that one needs to be careful about. We ask how much can we rely or push on redistribution alone. So one of the findings, looking at countries that have been successful in reducing inequality, including in Latin America, is that a big part of the story has to do less with what the fiscal system did through taxes and transfers, and more through labor income. You see the relative contribution of different sectors in the redistribution of inequality. There's also an issue of perspective. Using the fiscal system, and especially the taxation system, in a mimic way, by trying to replicate what's happening in developed countries, in developing countries, can be dangerous. Can be dangerous because even when taxes and transfers reduce inequality, in some cases, some analysis shows that can lead to an increase in the level of poverty. And this is easy to understand because these economies just don't have that many people that can be taxed with high levels of income that can be taxed. So it's not to say it shouldn't be done, but it needs to be done carefully. And a big message of our report is that we should not detach a discussion on taxes from a discussion on the use of revenues. And the two have to be seen in an integrated way. And the use of revenues has to be seen in a way that goes beyond just transfers, and has to be seen in a way in which these resources are allocated, for instance, for investments that build capabilities, and that build capabilities in those areas in which the gaps appear to be open. And of course, everything that has to do with redistribution is ultimately very political discussion, very context-specific discussion that is shaped by social preferences, by history, and by local context. So basically what we are suggesting is that it's important to include redistribution in the discussion, but once again to go beyond and to look at the set of policies that can have a bearing on outcomes when it comes to inequalities in communities or even development. So we should not wait only until people are taxed when they are active in the labor market, but we have to start thinking about what to do from the moment they are born, or even before they are born. Because some of the drivers of inequality in labor markets are determined by the pathways of people. Even before people are born, the way in which they are exposed to some stimuli is going to determine their cognitive capabilities. Early childhood education is very important and really not that part of the agenda in many developing countries. So the argument we're making is that we need to look certainly at what happens post-market, so the distribution, but we have to look equally at how markets work. So the issue of market power that I alluded to is very important, and you can think of policies related, for instance, to antitrust regulation that benefit both efficiency, because markets function better if you curb abusive use of market power by firms, but also leads to more equitable outcomes, because you sort of level the playing field for firms. So we try to make the case that there are many of these policies for which there's really no trade-offs between equity and efficiency, which is an argument that you often see made, right? Actually, this is all nice and good, but economies need to grow, so let's forget about the distribution, let's get economies growing, and then somehow things will trickle down. And also post-market, once people are no longer active in the labor market, they are still entitled to the same level of agency and dignity as they were in the labor market. So what happens post-market? So basically, what we are advocating for is the need for an integrated framework through which inequalities in human development and action on inequalities in human development is not seen exclusively through the angle of a specific single bullet or policy. So we're proposing a framework that hopefully will enable policymakers and the public discussion around a wider range of policies that can be mobilized to redress inequalities. So let me stop here and hand over back to Mansour.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and we're happy we invited you to get a really flavor of what is behind us in terms of the report. Just for those who do not know me, my name is Mansour. I'm the head of Inclusive Growth. So I won't dare present federal, and you've all seen his posters for those who are in New York posing. I heard he's running for something. I'm not sure what. But
nothing to do with the distribution of the
but really good to have you. I think this was very inspiring, and for a number of reasons. First, if we recall what we have as overarching goals of the Agenda 2030, it's about eradicating poverty, it's about tackling inequalities, and tackling exclusion. And by presenting a framework that goes not only beyond income, we all knew that this is why we have inequality at the heart of this agenda. That was one of the findings of the NDP era. But also going behind averages to unpack, concept like the Gini, and now really look at what is behind, what are the underlying, analytics that can actually shed more light on what the challenges are. But also looking forward, beyond today, what are the real challenges? I think all of that is extremely important, and two powerful messages you shared is this rise of the missing middle class or middle income. I think that is something that we need to reflect on, and I would say the same for those who are really at the very bottom of the income distribution, but also losing out. What does it mean for us? And the pledge to leave no one behind. That is something I think we really need to look at. Second, I think really strong takeaway messages is this need to be more proactive rather than being reactive in terms of policies. Because we tend to look at issues and then try and sort them out. Here the idea is to say, with this kind of analytics, we can look beyond and really try and anticipate the potential challenges and see how best to address it. So really thank you so much. This was very, very useful. I'm going to now to open the floor. I am pretty confident people have so many questions to ask. We have, I believe, about 40 minutes, so which is some decent time to engage. So 40 minutes, I said. No?
10:20.
Oh, I thought it was 11:30. Oh, it's 11. My bad. Then it makes it a bit more difficult. And I'll have to be a bit more selective question-wise, so I'll say one question. And please, no question with, different subset of questions, but just to engage. Okay, absolutely. So the floor is open. It's really open, so whoever wants to, shoot first. Seems like that you want to come in.
Thank you. I would have, excuse me, many questions, but I'll just have one. Indicators. Very little here about indicators. Inequality, adjusted HDI. How do we go beyond Gini, Halma, things which, by the way, aren't included in the global SDG indicator set for SDG 10 reports? What can you say about that? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Now let me just take a round of questions and then we'll go back to Peru. One time,
So, two quick questions. Thank you so much for this presentation. I think there's a lot still obviously to digest, and we certainly look forward to the report. One thing is I wanted to hear a little bit more from you on this element on social norms, because I find it very intriguing, the findings related to gender, and I can kind of speculate why, but I wanted to hear from you as you looked through the World Values database, why there is this backlash against gender equality when you're saying when there is some progression towards empowerment, and what do you see is the driving forces for that backlash? The second thing is, because obviously, the point is that then we can make the case that we will never be able to achieve 100% equality, at least in terms of gender. And the argument we made before, which everybody for sure shares here, is that we shouldn't be talking about horizontal inequalities, right? Inequalities also within groups, because gender is, I think, it's the one that's on the face of everybody, right? The second thing I wanted to ask you is that from this entire experience in dealing with the issue of inequality, and we've seen that climate change, inequality, these are the biggest trends and barriers to achieve the 2030 agenda. We've seen in the report of the Secretary General, we've seen on the global report, on the Sustainable Development Report. What would be your key recommendation for UNDP as an organization that needs to center its work on poverty to focus on? Because you started by saying, yes, a lot is around taxation, right, redistribution, and then you delve into other areas, right, pre-market, in-market, post-market, which interesting recommendations. So if we had to pick one or two recommendations to say these could be transformational for UNDP's work, and would be interesting for country officers to pay attention to this, what would be a recommendation?
Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Yes, my name is Suna from Gender Team, and Renata anticipated my question on gender. But I have another question. I personally have observed that a lot of people across countries and in my home region have gone to the street to demonstrate, to raise their voice against the systems that fail them. And often, one of the major concerns for them is the corrupted system. But what I want to ask is not about corrupted political system, but what I often observe is that there is a corruption in people's mindset, and that is deeply embedded, and that becomes part of the norm. So I was wondering how can you address that corrupted mindset and go a little bit deeper in these ethical norms? How can you address that through maybe policies and some concrete mechanisms?
Here's a question from Bangkok Regional Hub. Does HDR make any recommendations on expanding the tax base in developing countries? What can be done? Are there recent good practices, given the importance of taxes for quality?
Great.
Thank you for Oyanga. This was answered.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Maybe I suggest we address these first. It's, I think, a fairly
Great.
yes, set of questions, and then we can have second round.
Very good question, as always. We do look quite a bit on indicators. In fact, we have what we call a spotlight that asks how to choose an inequality indicator that goes through the axiomatic properties that a good inequality indicator should have. Palmer ratio, by the way, doesn't have some, but there is no good indicator. There's no perfect indicator. But the broader point that we're trying to make with the report is to decide this importance of going beyond summary measures, that they are useful. For instance, take the Palmer ratio. If what happens, and I've done some simulations with Miller, you can have two distributions in which the Palmer ratio changes very little, but if what's following out is the middle, if income flows for the top and for the bottom, like it happens in South Africa and it happens in Brazil, it looks like, then you're not capturing that with the Palmer ratio. So our objective is not to say Palmer ratio is not good or Gini is not good, is to make a broader point about the importance of understanding better the distribution of income and capabilities more broadly across the population. So summary measures are helpful as a window that can open a broader discussion on inequality. That's the claim we have in the report. And furthermore, there is now some innovative methodology that enables us to do this with the distributed national account, and that's why we have this collaboration with the World Inequality Lab that we highlight. All of it is very experimental, but I think it's, if you think about UNDP and now to turn to your question, I think this is an area in which UNDP can actually be a leader on, in working with countries to refine the methodology, because the methodology combines systems of national accounts, survey data, and distributed reports. It's very difficult to find an entity interested in handling all of these things. You have statisticians that are focused on national accounts, statisticians that focus on survey data. You have many entities that do a lot of work on inequality based on survey data. You have the Piketty team that do a lot with factors, but bringing it all together, I think it speaks to our strength as UNDP. So this is, we're calling for a revolution in metrics, and I see UNDP as playing an important role on this problem. On social norms and the backlash, our interpretation is that it has to do with, as we get close to power, you tend to see the backlash. We didn't run a regression or a sophisticated empirical model to prove this, but that's our hypothesis, I should say, our interpretation of why we're seeing this backlash. As I said, it's not happening in every country. But in the countries in which we see the backlash, we try to dig a little bit deeper and understand what could be the drivers behind it. And it varies from country to country. But the underlying theme is this, as power is threatened, and society is reacting. Key recommendations for UNDP. So, if we are right, if the claim we're making about the importance of having an integrated approach to redressing inequality that goes beyond fiscal and goes beyond redistribution and calls for this integrated approach, then I think there's a huge role for UNDP to play. And it speaks to our role as sort of integrator. It's where that often describes what's expected of UNDP. So, to answer the question from Bangkok, we didn't go in detail on how to expand the tax base in developing countries. Precisely because the narrative that we're building here, first of all, is a narrative about inequalities in human development that goes beyond just income and wealth inequality. In fact, most of the report is about inequalities that are not related to income or wealth. But if this claim is correct, is valid, then I see a huge space for UNDP to develop further the framework that we're proposing. We're proposing a framework that looks into basically mechanisms that can lead to the enhancement of capabilities and mechanisms that can lead to redressing inequalities in income and wealth, and how they interact with each other. So that could be explored further in UNDP. and taken forward programmatically by Isula's question, I'm not able to address it directly, but I can say that one of the messages in the report is that inequality ultimately is generated by processes that are deeply embedded in our societies, our economies, and our political structures. And it goes back to the framework. So to address inequality, we really have to think a little bit about power. Who holds power? Who holds economic power? And as inequalities in income and wealth increase, those that acquire economic power can also flex it in terms of political power that leads to the perpetuation of advantages for a smaller group of people. Again, the challenge is to see how we can generate incentives for change. And one of the proposals that we're making in the report, or one of the ideas that we're putting forward, is the way in which one implements the social policies matters. So social policies may get more public support, wide support, if they are focused or implemented in a way that are seen to benefit a large segment of the population. So if they are seen to benefit only those at the very bottom, the rest of the distribution, the rest of the population may not care. Or if services are only geared towards those at the very bottom, it may lead to some stigmatization, that they are seen as low quality, many part of the population. So how to create systems and implement social policies in ways that are that leads to broader public support. So trying to link the incentives a little bit. And so Renato, once again, on the question on focusing on poverty, by looking at inequality, we are focusing on poverty, right? Because the poor are not born poor, live poor, die poor, some unfortunately too, but it's a very dynamic concept. People come out of poverty all the time. So many of these people that were living relatively comfortable lives, if they lose their means of livelihood, they can actually be thrown into poverty. So if we don't have this broader perspective on how inequalities are generated in societies, then we will not be as effective in reducing poverty as we could. And once again, if we link it to the political economy of social policy, the political economy of social policy calls for an understanding of distributional implications. Otherwise, you may not have the political support to implement some of the social policies.
Thank you so much. You have more questions?
Yeah, there's one question from Guinea-Bissau, from Luca Monch Farello. I found it interesting the link between the taxes and the use of revenues in a context where trust between government and citizens weakens as inequality increases. What is the report suggesting to address this? To earmark taxes, for example, on climate change?
Yeah. No, exactly. So the point we're making is that's the standard economic answer. Is you raise taxes, the tax by itself may be regressive, but you can then recycle revenue in a way that handles it on the transfer side. So the net effect can be positive. But as Luca says correctly, sometimes people don't believe the governments are going to do this. Often they think that the taxes may be used for other purposes. It doesn't even necessarily have to be corruption, but just not used to their benefit. So that's why people often rebel. But the point we're making is as inequalities increase and become deeper, these challenges become even much more difficult. And so by redressing inequalities, you're putting yourself in a position in which the implementation of these policies may be easier to do.
All right. Any more questions before we wrap up? I understand that we're running out of time. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there are any pressing.
Or by email also.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, me an email.
Yeah, he's available. So maybe before we wrap up, let me first give the opportunity to Renata to say a word on the MOOC that we are designing on multidimensional poverty.
So Colleagues, just very quickly, in partnership, UNDP in partnership with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the Oxford University, in collaboration, UNDP, BPPS, in collaboration with regional bureaus, country offices, Human Development Report Office, memorandum is here. We are developing a massive open online course on how to design multidimensional poverty index at national and subnational levels, tapping on the rich experience of our colleagues in HDRO, from the rich experience of our colleagues across country offices, across all regions, to develop a MOOC initially to be rolled out in English starting in February 2020. Registrations are open. So if you go to this link here that we have provided, you can watch the trailer, you can see preliminary snapshot of what the content of the course and what we'll cover. And it's a facilitated course for 5 weeks and at free cost. So we basically ask you, if you have interest, register yourselves, tell your colleagues about it, tell your colleagues in country offices about it, because we want to roll out this massively in next year, early next year, but registrations are open today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I guess a lot of food for thought. And then again, thanks for Pedro for these very, very useful insights. Just one final word on this. I think we have discussed a lot inequality, but moving forward, the question is how we balance inequality and equity. Because here we're discussing, if you're looking at the little one behind the spectrum, it's about those who are furthest behind. And Pedro is telling us, look, moving forward, we may need, in order to garner support, broad support to also, kind of have the buy-in of other people that are not really those are furthest left behind. I think it's good food for thought, and happy to, to discuss what it is. Thank you so much again. This was very useful. Thank you so much.